Hello, my name is Vega Rivas, and today I'm going to be presenting my senior honors project, which focuses on the question of how do the effects of Trump's immigration policies influence white and Latino support for the American dream and institutional discrimination. Over the last several administrations, we have seen presidents taking a harsher and less inclusive approach towards immigration policy, and this has hit a peak with the Trump administration. Under the Trump administration, we saw policies enacted that led to the increased surveillance of ICE agents in sanctuary and unsanctuary cities, the imposed separation of children from their parents at ICE detention centers, and overall an increase of immigrant deaths at the US-Mexican border. But even with all of these negative effects, around the time that these policies were enacted, I saw a high approval rating for how the president was handling his job, with almost 60% approval amongst Hispanic Republicans. Now, this number surprised me, and it wanted me to understand the different narratives that exist here in the United States. In the United States, we see two prominent narratives. The first is that of the American dream. The first, that if you work hard enough, you can be successful in the United States, regardless of whatever background you may come from, and that would include immigration status. Diametrically opposed is institutional discrimination, which is a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society. We can see this here in the United States through gerrymandering, school redistricting lines, and even the criminal justice system. Previous research that I have worked on has found that these two clashing narratives, the American dream and institutional discrimination, served as the strongest predictors for people's political positionality, specifically that of conservatism, above traditional psychological constructs such as right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. And based upon those two narratives and the immigration policy we saw, I wanted to understand how the negative effects of that immigration policy would influence white and Latino support for the American dream and institutional discrimination. One of the leading social psychological theories that can help to explain the aims of my research is social identity theory. Social identity theory states that people are categorized into group memberships, and individuals who embrace their group identity are likely to favor their in-group more and more likely to feel empathy for their in-group members. However, if a person notices that they are a part of an oppressed group and sees that they have limited social mobility, the individual is likely to endorse similar strategies, such as removing themselves from the oppressed group and latching on to a group where they can achieve economic success. Another theory that can help to explain the aims of my research is the need-based model. The need-based model states that members of the more powerful group or majority group, when confronted with violent or immoral acts, will seek to establish their morality in order to re-enter the moral community. This behavior can be seen as condemning the immoral acts that they see. On the other hand, members of the depossessed group or minority group seek to re-establish their power behind the immoral acts that are committed against their own community. Based upon those two theories, I formulated my research hypothesis. The first is that Latino participants will score lower on the American dream compared to white participants in the control condition. The second is that Latino participants will score higher on the American dream compared to white participants in the experimental condition, and that Latino participants will score lower on institutional discrimination compared to white participants in both conditions. For my participant section, I had 147 individuals complete my experiment. My ages ranged from 18 to 84 years old. However, the mean age of my participants was 34. I had 58.5% of my participants identify as white and 41.5% of my participants identify as Latino. The way I measured and operationalized the American dream is through a subskill called personal wherewithal created by Beijing. However, for the purpose of this presentation, I will continue to refer it as the American dream. Two example statements from the subskill include any goal can be achieved with enough hard work and talent, and anyone who is willing to work hard can be successful in America. The way that I measured and operationalized institutional discrimination is through a subskill called institutional discrimination created by Neville. Two example statements from the subskill include white people in the US are discriminated against because of the color of their skin, and English should be the only official language in the US. For my procedure, participants were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. Participants in the control condition were directed to measure demographic information relating to the American dream, institutional discrimination, their age, gender, ethnicity, and their SCS. Participants in the experimental condition were first presented with two vignettes about a woman and her child dying at the border due to the policies enacted by the Trump administration. After reading these two vignettes, participants were directed to the same measure and demographic information. This is an example vignette that was presented to participants in the experimental condition. And it reads, Yalda Yalmida Herrera Hernandez had recently crossed the U.S.-Mexican border with her son, Iker Gael Cordova Herrera, and requested asylum. But under the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico program, they were sent back to Matamoros, Mexico to wait for an immigration court hearing. They grew more and more desperate while waiting for their hearing and died while it was still pending, CNN reported. Participants in the experimental condition read this vignette and another similar vignette before being directed to measure and demographic information. To assess the main differences of the American Dream and institutional discrimination scores between the conditions and ethnicity, I conducted a two-way ANOVA on SPSS. I dummy-coded the conditions and ethnicity, control and experimental as 0 and 1, white and Latino as 0 and 1. The American Dream and institutional discrimination scores range from 1 to 7 on the Likert scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The first finding I found was a significant interaction effect between the conditions and ethnicity. Now, this graph may seem simple, but there's a lot to uncover. The first is that Latino participants, indicated by the red line, scored lower on the American Dream compared to white participants, indicated by the blue line, who scored higher on the American Dream in the control condition. However, what we see that is surprising is what is happening in the experimental condition. Here, we see that white participants, indicated by the blue line, decreased in their belief of the American Dream compared to Latino participants, indicated by the red line, who had increased their belief of the American Dream. Again, participants in the experimental condition read two stories about a woman and her child dying at the border due to the policies enacted by the Trump administration. And after reading these two stories, white participants decreased in their belief of the American Dream, whereas Latino participants increased in their belief of the American Dream. Another finding I found was a significant main effect of ethnicity. Here we see that Latino participants, indicated by the red line, stayed pretty much the same in terms of their scores of institutional discrimination, regardless of whatever condition they were in. However, white participants, indicated by the blue line, are a different story. White participants in the control condition scored higher on institutional discrimination, but they decreased their belief of institutional discrimination once they were in the experimental condition. Again, in the experimental condition, they were presented with two vignettes about a woman and her child dying at the border. And after reading these two stories, white participants decreased their score of institutional discrimination. To reiterate my key findings in relation to my research hypothesis, I found that Latino participants did score lower on the American Dream compared to white participants in the control condition. The second, that Latino participants did score higher on the American Dream compared to white participants in the experimental condition, and that Latino participants did score lower on institutionalized discrimination compared to white participants in both conditions. The results for my first research hypothesis are aligned with research that find that white Americans consider working hard to succeed as a staple American value. And based on social identity theory, I assume that Latinos in the experimental condition would endorse the similar strategies, such as scoring high on the American Dream, and results for this research hypothesis confirm this belief. There's a strong notion to be made that since Latinos are a part of an oppressed group here in the United States, and being reminded of that by reading those two stories, it was likely that they would endorse a similar strategies, such as scoring high on the American Dream. Based on the need-based model, results for my third research hypothesis is consistent with the belief that white participants aim to sustain their morality in light of the brutal actions of the US administration towards immigrants and immigration policy. My research highlights the complexity of identity here in the United States. My results demonstrated that Latinos led with group identification towards an assimilative strategy in relation to the negative effects of Trump's immigration policy. What this shows is that Latino in politics are not a monolith. Latino political beliefs vary very much by their age, gender, and socioeconomic status. Future research can look at what is the leading factor among Latinos that drives or pushes them away from certain political ideologies. These are my references, and I thank you so much for watching my presentation. I look forward to any questions or comments you may have. Thank you so much.